Okay, this is the last in the series of lecture notes about imperialism. In this particular case, we're talking about the United States and Latin America, and what we're really referring to is economic imperialism by the United States. So the first thing that you need to know is that Latin America had become independent. Most Latin Americans worked on large landowners, haciendas or plantations. They had very low wages, and these workers accumulated a lot of debt. So again, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And the government, in a lot of cases, took over natives or church land and sold it to the rich. So the economic development in most Latin American countries was very much behind everybody else in the rest of the quote-unquote modern world. Saying that, okay, you also have a lot of instability politically in Latin America during this time period. Leaders gained fame and power during the struggle of independence, and afterwards a lot of Latin American countries had caudillos, military dictators or strongmen that basically ran these countries like their own little fiefdoms, like their own little nations. And almost nearly all Latin American nations during this time period were run by them. Okay, so caudillos versus democracy. Caudillos faced little opposition. The wealthy landowners usually supported them because obviously by supporting them they get what they want. Latin America also lacked any sort of democratic tradition. Again, they were mostly ruled by Spain and Portugal, which didn't have a democracy. They had kings and queens. And voting rights were restricted to the upper middle classes, and most of the people were not of the upper and middle classes, so they couldn't vote. And of course the upper middle classes liked the way things were for the most part, and so they always voted to install these strong men into power. So, what to do? Okay, outside investment, okay, and interference. Latin American countries did not reinvest in their infrastructure very well, and so they weren't very self-sufficient. They borrowed a large amount of money at a high interest rate to develop any sort of infrastructure, which again caused them to have more and more debt. And most of this debt was owned by the British, the French, the United States, and Germany. And so when they were unable to pay these loans back, foreign lenders threatened to take over these countries by force, and they threatened to take over these facilities and gain most of Latin American countries' industries. So these countries didn't go in there with a military, they went in there with basically their dollars, and they basically ruled these countries through their economic interest. Okay, that's why it's called economic imperialism. So instead of sending troops over and occupying a country, you do it economically. So, a couple things that you should know. First of all, you have President James Monroe sign off on what's called the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, which basically says the following, quote, "The American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonialization by any European powers." And that was basically a way of saying to the Europeans, hey, look, go take over other parts of the world, but if you start coming into Latin America, i.e. our back door, we're going to have a problem with it. So, not very long after that, 40 years after that, in 1868, Cuba declares independence from Spain. And in 1878, Cuba gives up this war with the Spanish, but it weakens the Spanish Empire. You have a patriot, a Cuban patriot called Jose Marti. He returns to Spain and launches another war in 1895. Unfortunately, he's killed. And by the mid-1890s, the United States had substantial business holdings in Cuba. And so Cuba is only 90 miles away from the United States. During this time period, the United States owned a large chunk of land and economic business in Cuba, and so they wanted to make sure that if anything was going to happen to Cuba, that the United States had a say in it. And so, what do? Well, the United States decides to back Cuba's independence, which pisses off the Spaniards, and you have what's called the Spanish-American War. The United States attacks both the Philippine Islands and they attack Cuba as well. And by this time, the Spanish Empire is dying fairly quickly. They don't have a lot of money left. Their resources are low. Their military is out of date, and the United States wins very easily against the Spanish. And so by 1901, Cuba is declared an independent nation, but the United States installs a military government in Cuba, and of course most of the Cubans say, hey, this is not what we're fighting for. But because the United States military is so strong and powerful, there isn't much that they could do about it, and of course they resent the United States interference in their own country. Here's one of the most famous persons involved in the Spanish-American War. He's Theodore Roosevelt. Okay, he's here and here, and eventually Theodore Roosevelt will become one of the presidents of the United States. Okay, here's two maps showing the Spanish-American War. The United States again launches an attack from Hong Kong. Remember we talked about Hong Kong in the China notes and why it was important? Well, here's a reason why. The United States forces go from Hong Kong to the Philippines and basically wipe out the Philippines Navy, or I should say the Spanish Navy that's in the Philippines. And of course the United States put the blockade around Cuba, and they also decimate the Spanish naval forces, and then they attacked the Spaniards on the mainland, and fairly quickly the Spaniards give up. So then you have a situation where the Americans have a war with the Philippines, okay, because the Philippines think that they're going to become independent because of this war, and the United States says, no, we're now going to take you over. And of course the Filipinos don't like that very much, and so there's a war between the United States and the Philippines, which lasts till about 1902. And again, the United States takes over the Philippines for quite some time. In 1916, the United States grants the Philippines autonomy and promises eventually self-government, which comes in 1934. And finally, by 1946, okay, the Philippines gained full independence after World War II. So it does take the Filipinos quite a bit of time to win their independence. First, they had to worry about the Spanish, and then, of course, they have to worry about the Americans. And the leader of the fight for Philippine independence is this guy right here, Emilio Aguinaldo, and he leads the Filipinos against the Americans. And here's some Filipinos fighting in Manila, which is the capital of the Philippines. All right. A couple other things that we should know about. First of all, during this time period, the Panama Canal is built. First, the French try to build the Panama Canal, but they fail. And during this time period, where the Panama Canal is located, it's controlled by Colombia, and the United States offers $10 million for the rights to build the canal, but the Colombians refuse, and so the United States encourages a rebellion in this part of their country, and again, some military leaders take over it, declare this new country called Panama, and the United States negotiates with Panama for rights to build this canal, and they win the rights, And so the United States starts digging into the earth to make a canal between basically the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. And finally the Panama Canal, is opened in 1914, which is important to note because World War I is going to start in 1914. And here's a picture of the canal. Okay, it's basically the main corridor between the Pacific and the Atlantic, and it's still heavily used today. And it's this narrow strip of land, right here. Okay, and it goes through a series of locks going from the Atlantic side, and then it goes through some locks, and then it goes through this man-made lake, and then it goes to the Pacific side, or vice versa. And here you have big, huge ships going through the canal. Ironically enough, ships nowadays are getting too big to fit through the canal, width-wise and length-wise, and so they're thinking of making a brand new canal in the country of Nicaragua. But until they do that, okay, most nations, most ships still go through the Panama Canal instead of going all the way around. Last but not least, you have something called the Roosevelt Corollary, which is kind of an attachment to the Monroe Doctrine made by Theodore Roosevelt. And it basically says that the United States has kind of like the international police force power for the Western Hemisphere, and that the United States can go into Latin American countries and possibly occupy those countries if it deems politically or economically beneficial to the United States. Or another way of looking at it is, if these countries become a political or economic instability for the region, the United States has the right to kind of go in and make sure that the situation becomes more stable for the Western Hemisphere as a whole. Okay. And here you have a political cartoon showing President Roosevelt, okay, and with his navy, the navy going around the Caribbean Sea, and he's kind of playing with it and toying with it. So anyway, that's pretty much the lecture on imperialism for Latin America.